Sparkly Beans. I have a video today. I wanted to talk to you about how astrology works and does it really work, and how would we know? And this is really a bigger question. Some of the things that I'm going to talk about in this video could also apply to tarot, to magic, to spirituality, to religion, to all sorts of things. But I wanted to narrow down on the question of, does astrology really work? How does it work? Because this is a really common question, and people who are new to astrology want to understand the mechanism, and people who are skeptical of astrology have a particular way of thinking about this, whereas people who are astrologers typically have a different way of thinking about this. But I think they all sort of mishmash together, and that they tell us a lot about our worldview, about colonialism, about the global north supremacy, white supremacy, and just the nature of how we make meaning. So if you're new here, hi, my name is Avery, and I help justice-aligned, neurodivergent, and nerdy humans to cultivate ease and self-trust towards growing into our emerging future. And one of the ways I do that is with astrology. So obviously I have a little bit of perspective on this. You know, I am an astrologer, and I do think that astrology works. However, I think that does it work is not necessarily the most useful question. I think it's a question that makes a lot of sense. Like, a lot of us, we first encounter astrology, and our opinion on it, right, is influenced somewhat by what we read about our placements. So, you know, somebody who sees themselves and has that spark of recognition in something about their chart, often it's the first time that you find out about something beyond your sun sign. When you learn about your moon or your rising or other parts of your chart, and you can think, wow, that's really me. For other people, their sun sign totally is something that has always made sense to them. And so they think, yeah, astrology makes sense because of my sun sign. But for a lot of folks, it's going a little bit deeper. And then for some folks, you'll learn about placements, and the reaction is, I don't see myself in that. That doesn't make sense. Or this part of this doesn't make sense. And so the natural inclination is to say, well, this doesn't work. This doesn't make any sense. And then for some skeptics, I think as well, it's not really about, it may not know anything about their chart. And it really just comes from, there's no reason why this would work, would do anything, would mean anything, right? The position of the planets in the sky, the time that we're born, logically, has nothing to do with us or our personality. So all of those things, all of those like ways of seeing things, come from a particular worldview. We can start with addressing the last one. If we think that everything that works, that is true, that is real, is something that we can understand with our mind, then necessarily things we can't understand with our mind we'll be skeptical of. We were taught in school, right? And of course, you know, it may vary who's watching this, but I think a lot of us were taught in school to use things like the scientific method, to privilege rational thought, to privilege reason, to privilege, you know, kind of like thinky brain, logic brain, the most, to prefer things that we can understand mentally. And there's a historical trajectory for this, right? This it's a long historical trajectory, but a lot of folks would point to the Enlightenment in the 18th century to a point at which it really becomes about reason and rational thought over God or the divine, or things that we can't understand and explain. There is a trajectory as well where the Enlightenment kind of lines up with other things, including capitalism, including colonialism, of course, white supremacy and white dominant culture is within that, includes all sorts of different kinds of oppression. And specifically, there's a lineup between these ideas of privileging thought and the mind and what we can categorize, explain, put language to scientifically prove is very lined up to binary thinking of like us versus them, the other versus the self, right? And this is way beyond the scope of the video. I'm not going to go into in detail, but you can see how if you're really focused on categorizing things, labeling them, having clear objective lines and categories, that could lead to things like eugenics, that could lead to things like policies that privilege one group over another. The reason this relates back to astrology and to this discussion is that, you know, we're still taught in school, this is still something that most of us learn, to trust what we can understand and what we can prove. And so it makes sense that, you know, when you hear something like where the planets are in the sky at the time of your birth has something to do with how your life unfolds, that the immediate reaction would be kind of skeptical. It would be like, that doesn't make any sense. The planets are up there. There's no, we don't have, you know, we can't see like beams of energy coming down to Earth and lodging within a person. There's no way to see that. And that's true. We cannot see that. Then the next like step is, okay, well, I think even if you tend to go with logical explanations for things, of course we know that there are things that we can't observe or that we individually can't personally observe, right? I have never personally measured many scientific phenomena that I believe exist. And then I think we tend to understand that there are things that we can't, that no one can scientifically measure, but that we understand are real. So like, for example, gravity is still a theory, right? A lot of the things that we learn about in school are, in science class, are theory. They're called theories because we can't fully 100%, you know, without a shadow of a doubt, prove the mechanism, but we gather a lot of evidence to get there. So we prove things empirically. We say, does it work? Does it work? Does it work? Right? It's a scientific method. It's a hypothesis, and then we test it, until we get to the point where we're like, we're pretty darn sure about gravity. And also, if you know anything about modern physics, you know, a lot of these scientific truths, we learn that there are anomalies, that there are, you know, very specific instances, you know, quantum mechanics or whatever, where it's mostly true 99.999% of the time, but there is a context where it's not true. There is, you know, we start to observe these things and go, oh, we need to tweak it. It's not quite right. So when you're thinking about astrology, I think it's pretty normal to say, okay, well, like, there's no, you know, way to see beams of energy coming down from the sky. But a lot of times, folks who do come to say, oh, maybe astrology does work, the way that they're convinced, and then the way folks who do believe that astrology works try to convince other people, is through empirical evidence. And is through, you know, coming up with a theory that makes sense and then showing it. So this is normally how somebody would answer the question of, how does astrology work? Does astrology work? They'd say, well, we may not know the exact mechanism. We may not be able to say there's beams of light down from the sky, or anything else. You know, we may not be able to prove that, like, there's neutrinos or whatever. But we prove it empirically by saying, well, there are thousands of chart examples that bear this out. We say, okay, sure. You look at your Aries moon and that description doesn't jive with you. That's okay. Because every placement, every signification, every, you know, anything in your chart is both, can play out in a lot of different ways in your life. So the description you read in a book, you know, is not going to have space for every possible way an Aries moon could look. And there's an interpretive art, and your chart has a lot of different pieces. So this is usually what we say, right? Aries moon doesn't make sense to you? Well, it's not just Aries moon, it's Aries moon in the context of the whole chart. And by the way, come get a reading, you can find out. Which, hey, I'm guilty. Come get a reading, you can find out. There's a link below. And we can, you know, there is like an interpretive art to this. But even the interpretive art, and I say this as an astrologer, I think it can get really frustrating when you try to make everything make sense in a logical fashion. When you try to interpret a chart and say, and some astrologers do have a more sort of like rational approach to astrology, where it's like, okay, we're gonna find the, you know, this, like if you have an Aries moon and it's related to this and it's related to this, this is gonna happen and we just have to figure out how, right? So it becomes kind of a digging expedition. I think a lot of people also think of their own birth chart, or think of a birth chart as this sort of like digging expedition, as basically like it's all there in the chart, and like understanding the chart is a finite thing and I could get to the bottom of it. So my goal is to like understand all the pieces and like how this relates to this and this relates to this. And like when you first start studying your chart, right, it's like, oh, there's another thing, and how does that go, right? You're learning all the pieces and you're trying to get as deep as you can. And I would posit that that's not the most useful way to think of astrology and to use astrology. Here's what I mean by that. So in the consulting context, in the context of like an astrology reading with an astrologer, I think that it always starts from the person in front of you. And so, and this is like very uncomfortable to the kind of like logical, rational mind that really wants it to be about, does astrology work, and wants to like prove it. It wants to show like you have these placements and therefore we're going to find this in your life. I don't think that's very useful, because, I mean, you know, unless your only goal is to prove astrology empirically, in the consulting setting, I think why astrology is so beautiful and meaningful and like why it doesn't really matter whether it works is that it gets to something about your humanity. And so instead of, if I see that you have an Aries moon, instead of trying to understand how that Aries moon plays out, I'm going, okay, I'm going to find Aries moon qualities in you, and I just have to figure out, you know, and I'm going to like focus on the chart. I'm going to focus on you, and I'm going to ask you, tell me about how you relate to some of these like energies. How does this feel for you? And actually, when somebody says that their placement doesn't make sense, I'm like, great, tell me why, right? That's a really useful starting point of like, oh, okay, I don't feel this Aries moon in this way. You know, these energies you're describing that might be some possible energies of an Aries moon. Okay. How do you feel about that? Do you want to experience? Where does that also come? You know, maybe your Aries moon is in the 12th house, and we can talk about what it means to have a moon in the 12th house. Maybe it's you know, there's another planet that's in aspect to your moon that is affecting that energy. Maybe you would like to access the traits that I might describe from an Aries moon. And so we can look at, okay, what might be getting in the way of that? What might be mitigating? What in the chart is kind of like, or not mitigating, but what is kind of like blocking or a barrier to that energy? And then it becomes a conversation of what is the presenting need for somebody, and how might the chart help us as a map to navigate that? Or maybe you have too much of the Aries. Maybe you're like, yeah, that totally vibes with me, and it's a pain in the ass. Okay, now let's look at why might that Aries moon be problematic. And what we're doing is we're going from the point of view, right? We're going from the point of your experience, and we're using the chart as a language. And then when we look at like that tendency to kind of dig and like to understand the chart, it's like, I don't think that, I mean, sure, you could try, but like, why I like astrology, why I think astrology is useful, is that it does provide a reference point, and that reference point shifts. So your chart doesn't change, but astrologically, you could describe this as there are transits to your chart, there's things in the sky that change over time, but even just in plain language, you could say your life unfolds, and there are different moments where you might want to access that Aries moon, you might not want to. There might be, ways that it comes up, times where it doesn't really matter. I mean, your moon often will matter, but where it's not really the relevant thing, the thing that you care about. And I think sometimes people who are skeptical of astrology and whether it works would be like, well, if you're having something in your life and you go to the chart and you try to find it, you're going to be able to find anything. And my little trickster response to that would be, yeah, you are. Is that a problem, right? Does that mean it's not useful? And this is where we get into, it can apply to anything, really. When the critique is, well, this metaphysical tool, you could use your mind and you could figure it out and you could, interpret it any way you want. I don't think that's a problem. Now, I do happen to think that astrology works for some reason. Now, do I know why? No. Do I know the mechanism? Absolutely. No, I do not. I do think that our chart is a map, and it's an accurate map, and I think it's an accurate map for everyone. However, that doesn't mean that we can empirically say, every single chart matches up to whatever description, because our trying to understand with our minds this star map, I don't think this star map is a logical mental language. And I think this is where the supremacy of the mind comes in. I don't think we'll ever get to a point where we can say, we can dig, and we can understand our chart, and we can say, yes, this is why this is here, this is why this is here, and here's all the ways it plays out into my life. No, I don't think that's true. I think that astrology provides a language, and there are a lot of different ways to read that language. There are a lot of different astrological traditions, and there are different, it's a very culturally relative, how you see different things depends on your time and place. There's all these arguments between astrologers about this one's more accurate, this way of reading is more accurate. And what happens there is that if you're using just the mind, you can prove pretty much anything. So I have hundreds of chart examples that say this. Well, great, I have hundreds of chart samples that say that's not true. And so you get all these astrologers saying, trying to do it empirically, trying to say, okay, well, let's find examples. I can prove anything true or false with examples. Human design actually talks about this directly, about the challenge of using your mind to make decisions to prove things in this way. Is that the mind can always come up with the devil's advocate argument. The mind, if you're always just using your rational mind, you can always prove something in any direction you need, right? There's always going to be an alternative. There's always going to be a way to say astrology is wrong. There's always going to be a way to say astrology doesn't work. There's always going to be... And so if we're grounding everything in the logical mind, we've already lost the argument. You could very easily, if I try to argue with you in that way, you can very easily tell me that astrology doesn't work. I think it works in some way that human beings will never understand, right? And that, like a lot of metaphysical things, I think the tarot works in a way that we'll never understand. And the mechanism may not be just one mechanism, right? There may be many reasons why astrology works. What it's about is finding the way that it works for you. It's about finding its usefulness for you. And I don't think it needs to be useful for everyone to be meaningful, right? I think this is another thing that the sort of global north, enlightenment, it's capitalism, right, needs to standardize things and needs things to work for everyone, and if it's not a universal solution, then it doesn't, then fuck it, right? I don't think that everyone needs to like astrology or use astrology. I think it's one way for understanding our human experience, and if it works, if it's something that you find meaning in, then great, and if it isn't, then it doesn't matter. And I think we waste a lot of energy sometimes trying to argue why it works and trying to like bring in everybody, right? Trying to like evangelize and like bring everybody into the fold and say, well, you figure out astrology. And it makes sense, right? Because it's so exciting when you do figure it out and you're like, whoa, right? Like everyone should know this. But it's not the only way. And it works and it's true and whatever, whether or not you ever look at it or reference it. Because really, I think that the base language of astrology, right, the core of astrology, is the core of literally everything. It's the thing we don't understand, right? It's spirit. It's it's existence. It's the same as trying to ask questions like, is there a God? Or why do humans, like, just leave it there. Some of these like fundamental existential cosmological questions, and they can be fun and they can be interesting, and some people like to argue them and like to think through them and but like trying to do that with your mind, you're never going to get to an answer. And so I think it's like, if you're interested in astrology, if you're curious about it, it's great to expose yourself to different interpretations, different ways of looking at a chart, different astrologers, do your own looking into it, but also just know that there's no like dogmatic right way to interpret anything. And so, it can be a little challenging to starting out, to just like try to understand, because a lot of sources will say, this is what an Aries moon is. There's a lot of like vested interest, and because so many of us are operating at this like rational level, there's a desire to be like, this is the thing and here's why. Because when something makes sense, when an interpretation makes sense, when our mind understands it, we're like, okay, great, I've got it, this is the key. And the secret is there is no key. So look into it, but just like know there's many different ways of seeing it. Know that your chart and the way you relate to your chart can unfold over time. That, again, like there's this imperfect interpretation that's happening here between where the stars were, which we know, and whatever else is in between and what that means. And that's the beauty of it, is the interpretation. And so like, you could say there's no meaning to an Aries moon, or you could say there's every meaning to an Aries moon, right? You could say that your life, if you have an Aries moon, is about figuring out what an Aries moon is for you. And that to me is really exciting. And that's the digging that's exciting to me, right? The going down into like, how are all the different ways my Aries moon can play? I don't have an Aries moon, by the way. I don't know why this is my example, but like, what are all the ways in which this placement can play out? Different placements, I think, will definitely like come up in your life at different times in different ways. And that's why like working with different astrologers is really fun and interesting, because it exposes you to a lot of different worldviews and a lot of ways of looking at things. And I would encourage you, like, if you want to see an astrologer, like I said, I give readings, but I would also say like, get a range of reading, right? Like for me, I'm queer, I'm non-binary, I'm disabled, neurodivergent. I'm also white. I come from the United States. I have educational privilege, right? Everybody's got a list of like identities and things about them, right? So like, go to different astrologers with different worldviews and identities. Go to astrologers that come from different parts of the world. Get readings if you can. And I know it's not accessible to everybody, but like, if you are getting astrology readings, like, try not to get all of your readings from somebody who's in the same tradition and in the same, the same age, the same race, the same gender, the same, right? Get a broad range of people, because it's not that any one of them is going to be right about your chart. It's that they're gonna give you different angles and different like views and different like lenses. Just like if you go to a tarot reader, right? There's a bunch of different ways you could interpret particular cards, and it's not like one of them is right, one of them is wrong. And it's not like, however astrology works, whatever the underlying mechanism is, let's say it is energy beamed down the stars, just for the sake of argument, what that means in your life could be a million different things, and they could all be right, and they could all be right at different times for different people. So I think my overall summary here is just that, like, how does astrology work? We don't really know. There's a lot of theories, a lot of ideas. You know, maybe it is something mechanistic. Maybe it is like literal energy beamed down. Maybe it is the planets are gods. Maybe it, you know, there's all different ways to think about it. Maybe there's something about the time of year that somehow, you know, that time. And if you find it fun to theorize and to speculate about that, sure, go ahead. But like, you're never gonna know. Yeah, I think my takeaway is that, like, trying to figure it out or trying to prove that it does or doesn't is not necessarily useful. Trying to prove that one particular astrological tradition is the right one and is the most aligned to how astrology really works isn't really that helpful. If you're interested in astrology, find the way that meshes well for you at this time and be open to change. If you're an astrologer, you know, or if you're somebody who does believe in astrology, you can obviously let people know about it. Share your excitement, but like, share your excitement about the particular things that you do that you find interesting, and be clear that, like, there are lots of different ways to do it, and your way isn't right and isn't the only way. And just because, you know, your way is what was practiced by a certain culture at a certain time, or just because your way is, you know, a way that jives with modern science and feels the most scientific to you, or just because your way is, you know, whatever, doesn't mean it's better. It just means that it's better for whatever purpose you're using. And if you know, I don't think there's anything wrong with advocating for an astrological tradition, but like doing so in context, I think that the way I do it is great because of this, right? I think the way I practice astrology, which is intuitive, which is very like intersectional, which brings in a lot of things about people's cultural context, which doesn't involve prediction or timing and is really just about, you know, the natal chart and how it unfolds in someone's life. Like, I think that way of doing astrology works well for, you know, introspection and having a you know, conversation with yourself, and can be used as a tool, is similar to therapy, or similar to, it's not therapy, but like similar to, you know, coaching, or like other kinds of ways of just like having more perspectives. I think the way that I do astrology is really useful for like perspectives that you might not have seen with your conscious mind automatically, or just questions you might not have thought to ask yourself, or, you know, for finding ways to navigate and to like move around and to work with the energies that are present and are here in your life. Works really well for that. Doesn't work well for other purposes, and I'm okay with that. So anyway, so that's my take on whether astrology works and how it works. The answer is yes, I think it works. The answer is how it works, we have no idea, and we never will. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. If you have any particular astrological topics you'd like me to cover, or anything else, or any other like metaphysical, cosmological, philosophical things that you would find interesting, you're free to leave a comment below. Also, just want to note that if you're not already subscribed to my newsletter, get on there, because that is where you're going to know when I have a new video up, but also when I have new blog posts up, you know, things I have from wherever on the internet. And I also do pop-up workshops that are like boom, 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 and you miss it. So, you know, to know when I'm doing something like that, to know what different readings are available, etc., etc., the best way to do that is to get on that email list. So that is found down there at the bottom. And we'll see you next time.